practice 2.9, we'll be looking at exercise prescriptions. So we've taken the big and we're going into the small, from planning an entire season to planning a workout. So we're going to apply the FIT principle, and again that's frequency, intensity, time, and type. So to begin looking at frequency, really in order to usually that general adaptation syndrome, we want to provide enough training stimulus and recovery to have that progressive overload and the desired adaptations for the sport specific we're looking at. So usually for a beginner, or maybe this is really early in the preseason, really about 2 to 3 times a week is the amount of workouts we want the athlete to do, because again, the body's not used to that training stimulus, and we need appropriate amount of recovery. Once we've established that, again, maybe after 4 to 6 weeks, we can bump it up to 3 to 5 days a week. And then once we really get into the heart of the season, after about 6 to 8 weeks of training, we can go 5 to 6 days a week of pretty intense workouts. Once we get into the postseason, we can back off that a little bit. So if we look at the frequency, how much intensity should we go? So we can look at intensity based on our weight lifted for resistance training, or our heart rate or energy expenditure for looking at more cardio activities. So get out your book and we will I'll walk you through some of these formulas listed here on these pages. So we're going to begin by looking at our 1 rep max. So if you take our book and we flip to page 452, you'll see a chart here, 17.7, on how to use the percentage of our 1 rep max. Again, our book goes through kind of how to do those testings for the different activities or muscle groups, but let's go ahead and figure this out here. So if I have a 1 rep max of a given workout, maybe I can do, maybe it's a seated row or something like that, 150 pounds. That equals 100% of my capacity for that exercise. So how can I, using that 1 rep max, what can I do with that? Well, how can I determine appropriate intensity? Again, depending on our goal, which we'll look at here, maybe I want to lift something 5 reps. So how can we determine that? Let's go to our chart here, and if 1 rep is 100%, I can go down here, and 5 reps, that's about 87% of my load here. So 87% of 150, I calculated that already, that's 130 pounds. So likewise, if I don't know my 1 rep max at this point, but I know I can lift, let's say I can lift 113 pounds, and I can do that about 10 times. If I look at my chart, if I can lift something 10 times, right here, that is about 75% of my 1 rep max. So if I can lift 113 pounds 10 times, that is 75% of my 1 rep max. Basically what I can do is add 15% of that, and that should get me up to my 150 pounds. So I can use it both of those ways to determine intensity. If we determine 1 rep max, we can determine it from there, or if I know a certain weight and I can lift it a certain amount of times, I can go up and determine my 1 rep max. All right, next we can look at our heart rate. And we can do that by using our heart rate reserve. And we can do that by using, it's called the Carvonen method. Now, Carvonen was an exercise physiologist, and he came up with calculating what is an appropriate stress or stimulus based on heart rate. So he came up with a number, I don't know how he did it, but came up with 220. And basically from that, we want to subtract our athlete's age. So let's say our athlete is 20 years old. We subtract that from 220, and we get 200. And this is the age-adjusted maximal heart rate. Another thing we can do then is we can use a number, is we take our resting heart rate. Now ideally, we want to do this before we get out of bed, or if you've been sitting for like 30 minutes or more. So you can take your heart rate, and I'm just going to count it for like 10 seconds. And then you can multiply that by 6, and that will get your beats per minute. So let's say for our athlete, they have a resting heart rate of 55 beats per minute, and that is their resting heart rate. So next, what we can do then is we can take our age-adjusted maximal heart rate, subtract our resting heart rate, and that is going to come up with our heart rate reserve. So these numbers are going to be important when we look at training. So ideally, we want our workout to be in something called our target heart rate zone. This is kind of the Goldilocks area, right? This is the target heart rate zone. This is where we want our heart rate to be within to maximize the training effect, which again we'll talk about later. So as for an athlete, we want about 60% to 85% of their age-adjusted maximal heart rate. So how can we do this then? Is we're going to take our heart rate reserve. Again, for this athlete, it is 145 beats per minute. And then I'm going to multiply that by 85%. That's going to be the upper end of our target heart rate zone. And I'm going to add that. Next, I'm going to add my heart rate reserve. I'm sorry, my resting heart rate. So if I multiply this, that's 123 beats per minute. Then I'm going to add my resting heart rate, and that is going to be 178 beats per minute at the upper end of my target heart rate zone. Likewise, I can do that for the lower end as well. So again, take your heart rate reserve, multiply that by the lower end of the target heart rate zone, and then you're going to add your resting heart rate. So if I do that, I will come up with 142 beats per minute. So I used to coach track and field, and I would have them do, maybe for the sprinters, they would do intervals, right, with maybe 100 or 200, 400 meter sprints. So maybe these are intervals of high intensity. 2, 3, 4. So maybe they do these 5 sprints. So they're going to come across the line, and they're going to be at or above, really close to their maximal heart rate. That's the goal. So when is it appropriate for them to toe the line and do their second interval? Right? Typically when their heart rate drops, we don't want them to drop out of their target heart rate zone. So again, for an athlete, I'm not going to sit there and count their beats per minute. Right? This is almost 3 times per second. So an easier way to do this is take their heart rate for 10 seconds. So what I want to do then is take this number, and I can divide that by 6, because that is going to give us our 10-second heart rate. So for this athlete, their 10-second heart rate is 30 beats per 10 seconds at the upper end, and it is 24 beats per 10 seconds at the lower end. So now what I can do is those athletes, they come across the finish line and their hands are on their head, their hands are on their thighs, they're gassed, they're breathing heavy, they're trying to walk it off. Maybe after about 2 minutes, right? They've got their heart rate breathing a little. I'm going to ask them to take their 10-second heart rate. And if they're around 26, 25, 24, right, they're ready to go again. Ideally, I don't want them to drop below that. So that's how I can use the Carvonen method and the target heart rate zone to establish intensity. One last thing here is how I can utilize intensity is through metabolic equivalence, METs. Again, that on page 564 we'll also go over that. But basically, one metabolic equivalent is equal to the energy used at rest. So at rest, we're using 1 MET. Walking, right? Walking to class from the parking lot to your class. Maybe you're at 3 METs. Maybe use some stairs. So maybe you're at 3 to 4 METs. So really, anything below 6 METs, this is called low intensity. It's pretty easy. Something above, right, 6 to maybe about 10 METs, this is moderate intensity. So maybe I go for a jog, and I can still talk in this intensity level. Maybe you're right around that 6 METs, I begin to break a sweat. Okay, so this is probably about that 60% of your target heart rate zone is when you're up in this area here. Really above, anything above 10 METs, like 20 is the max. This is vigorous or very high, oops, that's supposed to be high intensity or vigorous load. So that might be like, again, sprinting. That would be doing maybe box jumps or something like that. So we can determine intensity through those options. So finally, we look at type and time of applying the FIT principle. So depending on what the goal or the outcome is, or maybe which phase in periodization we are, if we want to focus on strength and power, if we're looking at resistance training, right, we're looking at maybe about 5 reps at high intensity, right? If we're looking for muscle growth or muscle mass, we're going between like 6 and 12 reps at before we go to volitional fatigue or failure. That's when you cannot lift the weight anymore. And if we're looking at endurance, right, we're looking at time under load. We're getting up higher, those more than 10 reps. Rest intervals are very important, so we can target those adaptations and recovery. So when we're looking at right within the workout, we're looking at between sets. That's important. Also between exercise bouts, right? So maybe you work out on Monday. When is it appropriate to work out again? Right? There's that inverse relationship between frequency and intensity. So the more intense the workout is, maybe the longer the recovery time. So again, this is kind of another chart we can use. So again, depending on what our goal is, we can look at the intensity of our 1 rep max. The tempo, this is eccentric to isometric to concentric muscle contraction. So, right, if we're looking at strength endurance, we want to lift the weight maybe with 1 count, and then the time we want to have a 4 count of the eccentric where that muscle's elongating. So we want to apply all this stuff. Be prepared to discuss and apply some of this stuff, any questions you have in class. And then what we're really going to do is apply this information to your portfolio athlete.